Now, with one day left before the US midterms, a final campaign push is underway. Seats in both chambers of Congress are up for grabs, as well as governorships and city mayoral offices. President Joe Biden has been campaigning in New York, where the state's Democratic governor, Kathy Hochul, is facing a tight race against her Republican rival. Former President Donald Trump was calling on crowds in Florida to support Republican candidates in Tuesday's vote. And more than 8 million young Americans are getting ready to vote in the elections for the first time. Many will be looking to elect lawmakers to bring about change. And experts are saying they're less motivated by party and more by policy.
Jamie is a dedicated climate activist. She was sending campaign postcards to people around the country before she was old enough to vote. Now, in these midterm elections, she finally has a voice. She's one of 8 million Gen Z first-time voters, and she's clear about what's at the top of her agenda.
They say we have, I think 8 years left now to reduce our climate emissions by 1.5 degrees in order for this planet to be livable. So the policies that are enacted now will determine the fate of this planet for centuries.
She's not a dedicated Democrat. But she, like many other young people, feels that when it comes to climate change, she has no other choice.
At the end of the day, if it's down to a Democrat or a Republican, Democrats are far more likely to either be persuaded or actually make the right decision for the climate.
Aiden is also a student and a first-time voter. He has two major issues in mind this election cycle, which makes choosing between parties difficult.
I think Democrats kind of have more of a initiative and drive to, tackle the climate change issues than conservatives. But I think economics-wise, I think conservatives have a better mindset going into that side of the climate change issue. Hi, excuse me. I'm part of a bipartisan...
He's involved with left, middle, right.
So the first question is, how important do you think your vote is in elections in
That's a student-founded news outlet showcasing diverse political perspectives from Gen Z. His work there means he talks with many people his age.
I think there's a lot of people like me who kind of don't see a fit in either party, so they're kind of just stuck in the middle, kind of, going back and forth between left views and right views.
Sandra Ochoa knows just how much young voters can be more focused on policy than party. She spent several months talking with first-time voters for the nonpartisan youth organizing group 18 by Vote.
Young people aren't too tied down to parties themselves. So I think if other parties were able to rise up to power and represented us better, I think young people would be very willing to vote for them because I don't think they're tied down to a party name. They're tied down to the issues.
First-time voters in the U.S. have seen the two-party system produce chaos and a stalemate, while real-life issues they care about become increasingly urgent. So young people will have to make frustrating compromises with their votes in this election, until the system, or the parties, adapt to how these new voters think about politics.
And to dig a little deeper into youth voting trends in the US, we can now speak to John Hulsman, who's a global risk consultant and a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. Welcome to DW, John. 8 million members of Gen Z are eligible to vote in the US, and they could be a deciding factor if they turn out to vote. Can you tell us, will they turn out?
No, is the short answer. But you're right, to go back a step, in the last election in 2020, youth voters traditionally never show up. This is always the sacred cow of American kind of thinking that if we could only, the Democrats can get the youth vote out, they'll win. But last time they showed up. Fully 50% of those 18 to 29 ended up voting in 2020, and that was the margin of Joe Biden's victory, because traditionally the youth vote is about 2-to-1 in favor of the Democrats. Biden has given them a lot on his plate this time. Certainly the end of Roe v. Wade and that returning to the states is an issue that motivates a lot of younger voters. And frankly, the bribe that was getting rid of their student debt, whereas I had to pay it and people not in college have to pay it. This was an enticement, to put it mildly, to get them out to vote. But so far, in the mail balloting that's been looked at, which is very minor, it's only about a third the total of mail balloting what it was last time. So that's back to its normal, really pathetic numbers. And that means the Democrats are likely to have a very, very long night tomorrow.
Now, the political divide in the US has, rarely been deeper. Are young voters as polarised as their older counterparts?
Most of no, in the sense that the overwhelming majority are Democrats. I mean, the way this works is that various groups are overwhelmingly one thing or the other. And it isn't that you try to get them to change in aggregate. You try to knock down those numbers. So, for instance, African Americans voted 95-5 for Obama. Republicans don't need to win African Americans. They need to knock that number down to about 75-25, and that's a huge win for them. Likewise, Hispanics have voted 2-1 for Democrats. The new number is about 50-50, which is a huge win for the Republicans. So the key is to knock down these overwhelming numbers. So younger voters still tend to vote democratically. It's about 60% as opposed to 67%. That means an awful lot of young voters do vote Republican, but the majority vote Democratic. Republicans either want them not to turn out or to vote Republican and knock down that advantage because they're going to win strongly on older, white, college-educated men.
You've talked a little bit about what, people are motivated by. I was in the US last week. I was speaking to a 25-year-old who has voted Democrat in the past. But he said, anything about these elections doesn't really affect my paycheck, so I'm just not going to vote. Is that something that a lot of young people would be able to relate to?
Absolutely. And I think that's a shrewd comment. And you were right to listen to him, because the reality is the Democrats bet that abortion would be the overwhelming issue, that somehow Donald Trump, who hasn't been in power for 2 years, would be the overwhelming issue. The issue is what it always is, as James Carville said, Bill Clinton's famously shrewd campaign manager. It's almost always the economy, stupid. And right now, with cost of living at 40-year highs, with inflation utterly out of control, with Biden having thrown gasoline onto the fire by trillion-dollar spending plan after trillion-dollar spending plan, there's really nobody to blame but him for inflation. And critically, independent voters, many youth, by the way, are independent voters, overwhelmingly blame the president for inflation, for cost of living, and for the recession to come, because the only way to get inflation down is going to be, as we've seen with the Fed, to ratchet interest rates up very quickly. Almost always, that's, as Larry Summers pointed out, that leads to recession. And young voters are, of course, the most vulnerable segment of society. They're the ones actually doing the jobs out there. So this affects them. To pretend that pocketbook issues don't motivate them is not to understand young voters.
John Holzman, thank you so much for your analysis. Really interesting.
My pleasure. Thank you for having me.